Right, good afternoon, grade 12s, on this freezing, freezing day of winter. Okay. So let's just first of all do a little bit of a talk on what our plan of action is for next week. So when you return to school next week, what we're going to do is we're going to work on genetics. Mrs. Prevalence and I have discussed this at length, and we've decided to deal with genetics. So I know originally when I spoke about it, I said to you that I would record a few lessons with the first few problems, going through them again, but the decision that we've made is that we will actually start right from the beginning again, because Mrs. Florenza hadn't done very much and I had done not that much more than she did. So make sure that next week when you come to school, you bring all your genetic stuff with you. Remember, you had some problems, some copies of problems that we were busy working through, and I think that you should have read through first few pages of notes on genetics in your textbook to try and revise terms like heterozygous, homozygous, locus, etc., etc. But we will start from the beginning again. Okay, all right. We'll see you next week. So this is the last lesson of human reproduction. It's the cutest little baby elephant on Wild Earth. Oh my word, it's so cute. Another baby elephant. Okay. I know that choice 1 has 2 lessons to go before the end of the week. Choice 2 only has 1. So this will be the last lesson. So for choice 1, I just want you to spend your last lesson this week revising the work done so far since lockdown started. Okay, we will have an assessment as soon as we're allowed to have an assessment. Okay, right, let's go. Okay. If you looked at the SAGs, aim 3 of the SAGs said you should have some knowledge of something called fetal alcohol syndrome, FAS. In fact, that's a very old-fashioned term, and I'm going to talk about fetal alcohol spectrum disorders, FASD, and I will explain to you at some stage the difference between the two. So FAS is narrower than FASD. Okay, all right, so let's go. Remember, you don't have to know all the detail of this section, but I suggest that you do have a little bit of understanding of the whole section, even if you just go through the PowerPoint once. Okay, so fetal alcohol spectrum disorders, or FASD. Alcohol use during pregnancy can result in a wide range of effects, including pregnancy complications, pregnancy loss, that's a miscarriage, birth defects, and lifelong learning and behavioral problems, as well as FAS. So FAS, or fetal alcohol syndrome, is a much narrower definition than fetal alcohol spectrum disorders. I'll talk about that. So collectively, these effects are often referred to as fetal alcohol spectrum disorders, or FASD. So in terms of a historical perspective, when did people even realize that this was a problem? The term fetal alcohol syndrome, or FAS, was not used until 1973. But there are many historical references linking maternal alcohol consumption with poor pregnancy outcomes. And the first scientific study was published in 1899, where a gentleman, Dr. Sullivan, in the UK, studied the rate of stillborn births. In other words, how many births occurred where the child was actually born dead. And then he also looked at infant deaths. So children, babies that died after having been born in the first little while of months after birth. And he compared the rate of stillborn births and infant deaths amongst what he called drunkard females in Liverpool prison versus the exact same women's non-drinking, non-in-prison female relatives. And he found that it was much, much higher in the females who actually drank during pregnancy. Now, he found it was in fact almost nearly double that. Now, these statistics obviously might not be scientifically very conclusive. So the first thing you need to know is, how did these women in prison actually get alcohol? How could they have been drunkards in prison? And in prison at that stage of the game, food was not provided for inmates in prison. And so what would happen is family members would come every day and bring food for the people who were prisoners. And so the females in the Liverpool prison were well supplied with alcohol. So they used to drink even although they were in fact pregnant. But at that stage of the game, no conclusive evidence had been provided for the fact that drinking during pregnancy led to problems. On the other hand, if you question these statistics, you must realize that the variables that should have been fixed or controlled were quite probably not. So all it was related females in prison, out of prison. Whether or not they had the same living conditions in and out of prison, the same healthy food in and out of prison, etc., there's no evidence of that. And so the results are not entirely conclusive, but they are. He must have noticed that this was happening to in fact have even started a study. So since then, many studies have been done that conclusively confirmed that alcohol use during pregnancy can result in characteristic physical, cognitive, that means ability to think and reason, and behavioral abnormalities. Right, so we're going to talk first of all about fetal alcohol disorder, fetal alcohol syndrome. Okay. So fetal alcohol syndrome is a specific but variable constellation of abnormalities seen in certain offspring who had prenatal exposure to high levels of alcohol. So there are a whole lot of different things that could be shown, the symptoms. Not all of them, not all children who have FAS or FASD show all the same symptoms, and some of them only show some of the symptoms. So typical symptoms are, and I'm going to go down the left of this diagram and then I'm going to go up through the right. Okay, first one, microcephaly. This means small-brained. Okay, small-brained, and I'll show you some evidence of that just now. Short, palpable fissures. And what a palpable fissure is a measurement from the inner corner of the eye to the outer corner of the eye. And children who have fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, fetal alcohol syndrome, have a very short distance from the inner corner to the outer corner of the eye. They tend to have a flat midface, so not distinct cheekbones. An indistinct fulcrum. And what a fulcrum is those two lines that run from below the nose to the top lip. And they're the thing that calls the Cupid's bow on the top lip, the two extra little curves on the top lip. So that thing is called the philtrum. The philtrum in a child with FAS or FASD is very indistinct. It's very flat. Normally you can't even see the ridges, and I'll show you some pictures just now. A very thin upper lip. Micrognathia, that means a small jaw. A short nose, which means that the distance from the bottom part of the nose to the top lip is very long. Okay. Minor ear abnormalities, including small pinny, so these little things that jut out in the ear. A very low nasal bridge. This means the little structure on which a person normally props their glasses if they wear spectacles. Okay. It's very flat. So this part of the face is very flat. It would be difficult for a person with these symptoms to be able to wear a pair of glasses and to keep them up. And then epicanthal folds. And we've spoken about epicanthal folds in my class. It's the little fold of tissue here that is typical of people of Asian origin, but people of Caucasian origin who have FASD, who would normally genetically not have epicanthal folds, do. Okay. So if a person is looking for diagnosis for whatever reason, maybe to explain why their children behave in a particular way or don't progress at school in a particular way, in the United States, there are lots of specialists who work on this. So there are specialized qualified medical clinicians who look at all the various features and then can say this individual has it or doesn't have it. Okay. To receive a diagnosis in the United States, an individual must show specific impairments to growth, both before birth and after birth, and to the central nervous system and specific facial features. And generally, they look to see whether there is a history of prenatal exposure to alcohol, which is very difficult to obtain. Firstly, because a lot of the mothers give their children up because they can't look after them. And secondly, even mothers who don't give the children up are not prepared to admit that they actually drank when they were pregnant. And you'll see a drink could be as small as one drink. So many children meet some, but not all of the criteria necessary for a diagnosis of FAS. You can see this child, very indistinct philtrum, very thin upper lip. Other than that, looks perfectly normal. Okay. Some other terminology. Fetal alcohol effects refers to an individual who has some, but not all of the diagnostic criteria, coupled with a history of prenatal alcohol exposure. And fetal alcohol spectrum disorder is a term that encompasses the wide range, the entire range of effects that can result from prenatal alcohol exposure. And this term is often used nowadays in preference to the very limiting term fetal alcohol syndrome. Okay, so we've spoken about all these classical facial features that are typical of a child with FAS, or even an adult with FAS. So this just shows you an epicanthal fold, both on the inner and the outer corner of the eye. So you'll see a little fold of tissue here. Now, again, I'm emphasizing an epicanthal fold can exist in people of certain origins, and it doesn't mean that they have FAS or FASD. Here you've got a child with fetal alcohol syndrome. You can see the very, very thin upper lip. You can see the short nose, and you can see the very smooth philtrum. Here you can see quite a short nose and a relatively short, smooth philtrum. But you can also, in this one, see the little jaw. Okay, micrognathia. Now this shows you a series of pictures of two different individuals, this one and this one, And what you can see is you can see already the features are starting to show here. Definitely there, and very clear features. The micrognathia, the short nose, short pulpable fissure, and the smooth fulcrum. Okay, you can see it very clearly on this lady, even into adulthood, very clearly. You can see all the features. So here are some children, 2 of which have got very distinctly and 1 not so much. So you can see a small brain, okay, microcephaly. You can see that the brain is small because the actual cranium is small. Very clear epicanthal folds, very clear short pulpable fissures. You can see very low down ears and small pinny, short nose, low nasal bridge, very flat, smooth fulcrum, and upper lip. Okay. And then this child, you can see also the narrow skull from there to there shows that the brain is a little bit small. Quite a low nasal bridge, short nose, smooth fulcrum, not so much an upper lip, and micrognathia, okay, short pulpable fissures, very low down pinny. Look, the top of the ear, if you had to put a line from the top of the pinna, it's much lower than normal. Okay. This child doesn't show as many effects, but also has some of them. So let's have a look at the actual brain of children who have FAS and don't have FAS. So this is a normal child's brain. Okay. Now, obviously, the child did die for the brain to have been removed, but this is an FAS affected child of the same age as this one. And you can see a number of things. Firstly, you can see much, much smaller. Secondly, look, very few fissures on the surface. And you know from when you studied this last year that fissures indicate increased intellectual development. So the fact that the brain is very smooth also shows that there are problems. So malformation of brain tissue, failure of specific brain regions to develop or to develop correctly, especially in the cerebrum, which remember you learned last year was a big part of the brain. Cerebellum, which remember you learned last year was the little part tucked in underneath here, which is to do with balance and motor coordination. And then also the corpus callosum, which I'll show you now. And then when a brain is developing in an embryo, certain cells form in one place and then move to a different place. And with FAS or FASD, some of the cells don't do this. They don't move. Okay. And then cell death. Okay. As well as abnormal distribution of neurons and abnormal neurotransmission. In other words, the passing of impulses from one neuron to another neuron. So abnormal neurotransmission and abnormal distribution of neurons in the cerebrum, which remember you learned last year, was the brain region associated with the functioning of the senses, judgment, reasoning, languages, and inhibitions. So this is a normal brain. These two are of children that were prenatally exposed to alcohol. Now what you can see here, if you compare it to the normal, is that this has a very slanting back forehead, as does this one. And what is that saying? It's saying this region of the brain, the frontal region of the brain, which is associated with all the higher order thinking skills, judgment, memory, logical thought, etc., has not developed properly in these two children. Has here, hasn't here, or here. Okay, much smaller brain. Okay. And this is the reason why the bridge of the nose is so flat in an individual with FAS or FASD. Because the frontal region of the brain, this part here, is not developed in those two. Right, so damage to the cerebrum can result in an impaired ability to plan, organize, sequence, or to think abstractly. And it's as simple as, you know, when you get up in the morning that you need to put your underwear on before you put your outer clothes on. A person who has FAS or FASD very often doesn't know that, and it doesn't matter how many times they get taught that. They can reach the age of 9, 10, and they still do not know how to dress themselves in a sequence. Okay, they have poor judgment. They have poor problem solving and reasoning skills, and they are slower and less efficient in the processing of information. So remember, you learned last year that the corpus callosum provides a connection between the left and the right cerebral hemispheres. It's this hard strip of white tissue. And what you can see here is that it's not very well developed in this individual. So again, this is the normal individual, and these two have FAS or FASD. And this child doesn't even have a corpus callosum, which means that there's no connection between what the left and the right cerebral hemispheres are doing. Okay. Cerebellum, this little part that tucks in under the back of the brain, it's involved in coordination and movement, as well as motor and non-motor learning and development. And prenatal exposure to alcohol can result in reduced size, reduced cell number, structural abnormalities, and abnormal neurochemical activity in the brain. So, what are the variables that affect the extent or the type of damage caused by prenatal drinking? And there are some fascinating things here. The first is the timing of exposure to alcohol relative to the development of the fetus or the embryo. And you know that different organs are developing in an embryo or a fetus at different times. So if a person has alcohol at 3 months of pregnancy versus at 6 months of pregnancy, different organs are developing that's going to affect them differently. And then some neurons, which remember are the cells in the nervous system, are vulnerable at the time when they're differentiating. But others die when exposed to alcohol prior to or after they've migrated to a different region. I don't obsess about this, it's just of interest. So what you will see here is these are the times during which those particular organs are developing. So in the case of, if you look at the drawing on the right here, the central nervous system, which is the brain and spinal cord, is developing from the age of 3 weeks until 16 weeks. Okay. The heart, on the other hand, from 3 and 3.5 weeks, halfway through the 3rd week. There we go. Let's cover our backside here. Until halfway through the 6th week. The eyes, very different, the lower limbs, etc., etc. And so, depending on when the mother drinks during the development of the embryo or the fetus, it would affect different organs. First of all, let's just talk about this word teratogens. So this is something taken during pregnancy that will affect the development of the embryo. That's what a teratogen is. So way back in the day, in the 1960s, there was a tablet which was given to pregnant women to help them with morning sickness and also to help them sleep, if I remember correctly. I can't remember what it was called, but the children were born without developed arms and legs. So they would have, if you look at this drawing here on the right side, they would have just tiny little stumps here. They wouldn't have all the rest of the arm or the hand, or maybe even the hand was attached to a little stump of the arm there. I forget what that teratogen was called. I do know this. Okay, so still going through variables that affect the damage caused by prenatal drinking. So the frequency of prenatal exposure to alcohol. Is a child exposed more than just once, for example? The amount of alcohol, the volume, should have been consumed per part. The mother's health status. If a mother is in poor health, then it affects the child more than if the mother's in very good health. The genetic makeup of the mother and the fetus. This is a very interesting one. The number of children the mother has already had gets worse if she's had more children. So if she drinks exactly the same volume of alcohol at exactly the same times for her fourth child as she did for her first child, the fourth child would be affected more seriously. The mother's age. The older she is, the worse it is. So what are the results of prenatal exposure to alcohol? First of all, cognitive disabilities. And I showed you the part of the brain that is to do with thinking and reasoning, and showed you that it's reduced in a child with FAS or FASD. One of the things is mental retardation, and that is a term that is still used when discussing FAS, although it's not really used so much to describe a person who's got cognitive disabilities in the real world now. And IQs can range from 30 to 130. Now, an average IQ is about 100. So 130 is nice and high, but 30 is really, really low. So learning disabilities, developmental delays, e.g. with learning to speak, with the ability to tie shoelaces, with toilet training, that kind of thing. And then a potential academic ceiling. In other words, there's a limit to how far they'll progress in school. They have problems with memory and processing information, and can be told the same thing day after day after day. It doesn't actually, it's not retained. Okay. And then attention deficits. So you know what attention deficit is. Okay. So children with FAS or FASD have impaired learning abilities and impaired memory. They also have visual spatial functioning impairments. So they have difficulty with understanding the spatial relationships between various objects. So if, for example, they're crossing a road, they can't understand or judge how far away a car is, whether it's safe to actually cross a road. But because they have poor judgment, very often they don't even realize that it's not safe to cross the road. And then also the ability to recall spatial relationships, you know, how far away is school from home kind of thing, or to recall visual details. You can imagine this makes school learning a nightmare. They have impaired higher order cognitive processes such as planning, organizing, sequencing, and abstract thinking, resulting in problems with routine activities such as getting dressed. They have problems with maintaining attention and with motor control. I hope you learned last year what motor control is. It means control of movements. So there is impaired social functioning, and disturbed behaviors and psychiatric disorders are also very common. And these are ongoing. So it's not that when a child reaches adulthood, all those things are gone and all the things are fixed. They're not. So 94% of the individuals in one particular study had long-term mental health problems, and 52% of the individuals had ongoing depression. Their psychosocial behavior is poor. They tend to be anxious, they have poor social skills, their interactions with others, and their manners, what we perceive to be normal manners, normal good manners, very poor. And low academic achievement, I've spoken about that, that's common. Okay, so children with FAS and FASD, followed into adulthood, continue to exhibit problems with employment, with relationships. So 90% of them have mental health problems. 60% have disrupted schooling or were suspended from school, in other words, expelled. 50% of them, once they had left school, had trouble with the law or were convicted of a crime. 50% demonstrated inappropriate sexual behavior. 30% had alcohol or drug problems. 80% had employment problems. 80% were unable to live independently. For the rest of their lives, they needed care. So let's have a look at prevalence in the USA and in South Africa. In the USA, it is believed that 10 in 1,000 children have FASD problems. In a study done in 4 areas in Gauteng in 2003, it was found that 22 7-year-old children out of the 850 examined had FASD. And one study in the Western Cape found that between 40 and 46.4 children in 1,000 were affected. Now somebody can do arithmetic and work out what percentage that is. It's high. And then another study found that 25 in every 1,000 7-year-old children tested in Soweto had a severe form of the syndrome. So not a simple superficial form, but a severe form of the actual syndrome. So these are people who are going to have problems and have to be looked after for the rest of their lives. I know that a lot of doctors say it doesn't matter to have 1 glass of wine when pregnant. However, the experts in the United States are very, very clear on this. Not even a single glass of wine. As soon as a person suspects pregnancy, to stop drinking. That's what the experts say. And I will go with what those experts say about it, because they have done intensive studies in the United States. We haven't really done that here in South Africa. So I did 2 courses at the University of Madison, Wisconsin, on FAS and FASD. And I would say, you don't want to do this. It's going to affect that poor child for life. Okay, so now don't learn all those details.